O Attic shape, fair attitude, with breed of marble men and maidens overwrought, with forest branches and the trodden weed, thou, silent form, dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity, cold pastoral. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Well, that was the last stanza of a poem, which is not the main subject of this episode, but which I think kind of centralizes a question that we've been touching on for a while, which is this idea of the relationship between truth, beauty, and goodness, which we should know about on this show because this is the show about truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters, right? I mean, central to a classical education is some notion that those things exist, that they are eternal, and that they are, at least in some part and by some process, knowable to the human mind. And these are some of the issues which become central also in Plato's Republic, Book 6. So I began with Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn in order to lead us into our next Republic episode. And those who have been with me for a while will know that we are reading through the Republic book by book. I think this is essential. It is a requisite of a classical education to have read the entire Republic. Obviously, I'm not reading the entire thing aloud, but I am walking through the arguments of the whole thing because I think as a foundational text, with all of its excesses and curiosities and complexities and difficulties, right? It's something you need to know about and wrestle with. It's about the perfect state, the Kallipolis, which is the polis, the city, or indeed simply the government, or not even, I mean, more than the government, really, the small c constitution, the political life together, which is kalos, good and beautiful. And even that word in Greek, meaning both things, sort of combines the concepts. And there's another word, kalokagathos, which is a kind of amalgamation of kalos and agathos, good and beautiful. So these two concepts in Greek thought are intimately linked. And when Keats starts talking about the beauty of truth and the truth of beauty, which we've addressed before, it's obviously the title of my dad, No Relations book, The Truth and Beauty. And we talked with him a little bit about it. And now we get to the meat of it in book 6, rather. And I almost said book 7 because that's the next one. Book 7 is the famous cave book. So I've been building my way up to getting there. And on that episode, I've got an exciting thing to announce as well and say when we do that one. But for now, we have to do book 6 because it's crucial. And people they take the cave, the famous metaphor of the cave, and they lift it out and they quote it, but they don't talk about the groundwork that's laid for it in book 6. So this is really a pivotal book in a lot of ways. Just to remind you where we've been, right? The dialogue is mostly between Socrates, the character of Socrates, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are two brothers of Plato, sons of Ariston. And then Thrasymachus is around as well, and indeed his name is mentioned in this book, and we've had other characters as well, like Cephalus and so forth. But really, this is a Glaucon to Socrates kind of communion with interventions from Adeimantus. They start out talking about justice, and whether it's good to be just, even if you don't get rewarded for it. That's kind of the inciting question, and we've talked about the ways in which that question comes back up again and again, even as they kind of veer off into one of the great things about Platonic dialogues is that they're works of art as well as works of philosophy, and what they depict is the nature of really good conversation among friends late into the night. We know that this conversation takes place late into the night because the sort of quasi-sequel, Timaeus, talks about how they talked all night through. And we have this in the symposium too, like when you just really get on a track with your buddies and you're really trying to hammer something out, it kind of it mirrors that. It's a mimetic depiction of that. And so the conversation kind of meanders into these byways, which turn out to be kind of the meat of the thing, and they expand out into these much deeper questions. So from would it be good to be just even if we were punished for it, we get to what is just and what is justice, which leads us to a discussion of the soul and the virtues, right? And we have the cardinal virtues, which have to do with the three parts of the soul, the logos, the reason, the appetites, and the thumos, the courage, right? And these each have, Andrea is courage, excellence of thumos. Sophrosyne is sort of moderation and restraint in one's desires. Sophia is wisdom. And then we have dike, justice, justice, which is rightly ordering the whole thing, letting the ruling part rule, which is to say that the mind, the rational part rule, even as the passions and the desires are part of you, the rational animal, right? So we've been talking about what is justice, and in order to get there, we started talking about building out in the sort of like Age of Empires way, building out the imaginary perfect state, because that was sort of this fundamentally Greek idea that if you can map something onto a big scale, you can find it then again in miniature, in microcosm in the human. So the city is the sort of big scale justice question, and the human soul becomes the small scale justice question. And now we are kind of in a new stage where we have identified, or Socrates thinks he has identified, the people who must rule, and that is philosopher kings, right? The famous philosopher kings. We've said before, these are not like academics with bow ties and eggheads in ivory towers. We're going to get into that in this book a little bit. You know, the Aristophanic parody of these people as like pasty-faced eggheads is not really accurate. These are supposed to be lovers of the true, right? Lovers of the true in itself. And that's where we're getting to now, this question of, well, how are we going to identify those people and how are we going to train them? And that's now going to become the fixation of the next few books, right? And certainly of book 6, it's a question of statesmanship. Dan Mahoney, a frequent contributor to Claremont Publications, has just written a book on statesmanship. It's a really crucial topic, an indispensable topic, especially for our COVID era where we think we can't outsource everything to experts, right? Who will just give us the mathematically right answer. Like, you can't do that. You have to have people like Churchill who can exercise prudence in the moment. So this is really the question. How do we identify the lovers of the true and train them up to be rulers of the state? If you love the great works of the West, and I know you do because you're here, I cannot recommend the Ancient Language Institute highly enough. It will really change your life to learn one of the classical languages, or many of them. Ancient Greek, Biblical Hebrew, and Latin are all profoundly life-changing experiences, because I call them experiences more than languages because they bring you face to face with these authors, people like Aristotle, Cicero, Plato, the Bible, right? And what's great about ALI is that they get you in front of those authors as quickly as possible. You learn through reading rather than having all these massive sort of prerequisite sheets of grammar and stuff. You know, you learn those points through reading, and they will get you reading, listening, and speaking these languages from day one. If you go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics, that's ancientlanguage.com/heretics, you will get a 10% discount on tuition with the promo code heretics. You got to use that promo code because this is just for my listeners. These guys have been pals for a while now. I'm so impressed with the work that they do. If I didn't already know these languages, I would be taking these courses. They will enrich your life immeasurably, and you don't have to have a PhD to do them. They will take people at every skill level and train you up. Go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics and use the offer code heretics to get a 10% discount on tuition. So remember that book 5, the book before this one, ended with a discussion of what is philosophy, which is kind of an important question if you're trying to discern who is a philosopher, right? And so philosophia, the love of wisdom, or the love, it turns out, of truth, turns out at the very end of book 5, it turns out that we must call philosophers, rather than lovers of opinion, those who delight in each thing that is itself. Remember that we have in Plato, running always through the dialogues, this distinction between that which is and that which is the same always and unchanging, the realm of the forms, right? And that which is always becoming and changing and decaying and passing away. And this corresponds in the Greek to two kinds of knowledge, or two kinds of, let's say, cognitive operation or human perceptive activity, whatever fancy philosophical term you want to apply to it. In Greek, we say doxa, which is what usually gets translated as opinion. It's not quite right. We say opinion like that's just your opinion, man. But it's your whole impression of the world. How the world seems to you. And that might have elements of truth in it, or it might not. You might have a sense from your experience that, like, there's such a thing as a table, without knowing that there's like a Platonic form of the table. And yet, you know, it is true that there are tables, right? And so doxa is your sensory mediated experience of the world and the conclusions that you draw from it, rightly or wrongly. I mean, if you're having a fever dream and you're hallucinating, then your doxa is totally false. But you can have good doxa and bad doxa. But in order to truly be a philosopher, right, you have to move out of this shifting and changing world and abstract from it the pure truths which are knowable in themselves, right? And that's how you get to philosophia or episteme, right? Scientific knowledge. And this is where we get our word epistemic, right? This is a kind of knowledge that is in the abstract, that is direct, that grasps the nettle of the thing in itself, the essence of the true, the good, and the beautiful, rather than true things, beautiful things, and good things that we might see in front of us. And the ladder that they climb in the symposium is sort of related to this as well. So that's what a philosopher is. Now we start talking about whence comes such a man, right? Like, when are we ever going to find somebody that truly spends his life gazing into the abstract realm of that which is eternal? And here is where we start to get into this question, which is, of course, always inflected with the knowledge that Socrates, who is the main character in this dialogue, was killed for being that guy, right? And so Plato has this sort of tragic view of life. Some might accuse him of having an embittered view of life, a bit of sour grapes. And if you were Aristophanes, you might have a field day saying, well, in fact, like, you are just this kind of bitter egghead, right? Like, nursing your wounds from political failure. But let's let Plato and Plato's Socrates speak for themselves, talk about how to find the ideal statesman. So they're talking about, they're doing a talent search, right, for the ideal statesman. This is Stephanus, page 485c. Socrates says, well, consider whether it is necessary that those who are going to be such as we were saying have this further characteristic in their nature: no taste for falsehood. That is, they are completely unwilling to admit what's false, but hate it while cherishing the truth. It's likely, he said, this is Glaucon in response, right? Note this, the language here, right, which is purposefully emotional. It's not just about your kind of abstract commitments, but about your habituation and your ethical character, that you love the truth and you're happy even to be corrected because it's true, right? I mean, we all, I think, all of us who sort of strive for virtue, we know that there's this part in us. It's small and it's clouded by sin, but there is this part of us that just loves the truth, right? And hates falsehood and rejects it. And Socrates is basically saying cultivating that and finding that is the whole game here. You need to not just not say false things. You need to hate falsehood. You need to have the right emotions or desiderative, appetitive responses to it. He says, it is not only likely, my friend, but also entirely necessary that a man who is by nature erotically disposed towards someone care for everything related and akin to his boy. Bloom, who's the translator here, Alan Bloom, translates this volume and makes a note here that he's doing this interesting thing, Socrates is, by appealing to Glaucon's military and erotic sensibilities. So even as he's talking in these abstract terms about the true, the good, and the beautiful, he's also likening it to the kind of earthly things that he knows Glaucon loves. And Glaucon is sort of a lusty young man, right? So he's talking about it in erotic terms. And it turns out, of course, that those are very apt terms because love of the good, right, is a kind of passion pursuit, which is actually deeper and more powerful than just any particular sexual appetite you might have, right? It turns out in the symposium that this is true eros, true desire. The whole purpose of desire, right, is to lead us to give birth within the beautiful, or however Diotima would put it, right? So he goes on with this metaphor. He says, now, could you find anything more akin to wisdom than truth? Of course not, he said. Now, is it possible that the same nature be both a lover of wisdom and a lover of falsehood? In no way. Therefore, the man who is really a lover of learning must from youth on strive as intensely as possible for every kind of truth. Entirely so. But further, we surely know that when someone's desires incline strongly to some one thing, they are therefore weaker with respect to the rest, like a stream that has been channeled off in that other direction. Of course. So, when in someone they have flowed toward all learning and all that's like it, I suppose they would be concerned with the pleasure of the soul itself with respect to itself, and would forsake those pleasures that come through the body, if he isn't a counterfeit, but a true philosopher. That is most necessary. This is where we get the word Platonic, like it's a Platonic relationship. We don't have sexual desires for each other. Is this idea that this prioritization of the spiritual, the psychic, the soul realm, so much that you wouldn't pay any attention to the distractions of the flesh. And so you climb up from having physical intimacy, you climb up to having this sort of soul-to-soul intimacy with the truth and with those who love the truth. And so this is why, even though Plato in other parts, right, has plenty of like sex in his characters. If you read the Charmides, there's like a lot of kind of lustiness and jokes about it and stuff. Even though that's true, and it's not entirely apt to picture Plato as this like sexless scold, nevertheless, he does have this idea. This is where we get the idea of a Platonic friendship. I don't think people always quite understand that when they use that word, but that's the idea, right? It's strictly Platonic, meaning we just love each other's souls, you know. And so this is one of the characteristics of the good statesman, is that he would be so passionate about the truth that at least he would be indifferent to the other temptations, the temptations of the flesh, the temptations of lucre, the temptations of falsehood, right? Bribery, all of this stuff. And so this part's pretty good, right? We would imagine, you know, if that's what it means to be a philosopher king, then fair enough. Let's try to find them. He goes on then to enumerate a bunch of other virtues. I think these are interesting just to kind of rattle through because they are the virtues of the statesman, and they're related to the cardinal virtues, which are just the human excellences, which I mentioned at the beginning, right? But they are somewhat different than those virtues. They kind of go above them and extend them in interesting ways. So first of all, we learn that that he must be a friend. The good statesman must be a friend of truth, justice, courage, and moderation, right? So those are the cardinal virtues. He has to love them. He has to be a lover of knowledge. He has to be philosophical and not, conduce and not be seduced by bodily pleasures. Fair enough. And I've mentioned this one already. He can't have any love of money. So he can't be a money grubber, and because that will, again, distract him and divert him from what is truly good. If you can bribe a politician out of doing what's right, then he's not a very good politician, right? And he's not a very good philosopher king. He must have great-heartedness and liberality rather than illiberality. And these are words in Greek that are worth paying attention to. The great-heartedness is megaloprepeia, and it literally means what is fitting for a great man. And it's contrasted with, when we say illiberality, we think, well, that he's somehow too conservative or something. But no, an eleutheria. Eleutheria is freedom, right? To be eleutheros is to be free. And so great-heartedness is sort of a detachment from, a freedom from the desires and the temptations of the world that enables you, right, to be free in your choices, right? We've talked on this show before about the distinction between freedom from and freedom to, right? So if you're really free to do the good, right, you have to put constraints on yourself in other ways, right? And this is the kind of freedom from your desires, right? So your desires might just tell you to do this or that at any given moment. Many people are sometimes said slaves to their passions, right? And so that's the idea here, right? That megalopropeia is contrasted with quote unquote illiberality, which is unfreedom, right? Unfreedom from the passions. No fear of death. Right? They can't fear death anymore because that's also a love of something, right? Love of life. And this is related to Andrea, right? To courage. So just as you can't be able to, it's bad if you can sway a politician with bribes, it's also bad if a politician can be swayed with threats of death. I mean, when people were admiring Zelensky for staying in the country, right, for staying in Ukraine during war, when people are looking at the Supreme Court justices and seeing all these threats of protests at their house and stuff with the leaked Dobbs decision, like that's, this sort of difficult quality of the statesman, that they have to be ready to stay the course, even if it threatens their life, right? So that's no fear of death, no love of life. And then there's kind of, it sort of slips this one in. He can't boast. He can't be an alasdon, a braggart. Alasdo is to boast. And that's, I think, related again to the love of truth, right? And then an interesting one, what we might call clemency, gentleness. He needs to be dikaios kai hemeros. Dikaios, obviously just. And hemeros is contrasted with savagery, agria. And douskoinonatos is like, he can't be unsociable. So there's this sort of idea that like he's got to be charming and turned out. And we go from there into these musical metaphors. He's got to be well refined, he has a charming nature, sense of schema. Schema is like good proportion, especially in like statues and sculptures. And so he has to have all of these qualities, which it's interesting. You can see there's an ancient debate about the unity of the virtues. Is all virtue one? Or are there many different kinds of virtues that have distinct goods in mind? And you can see how these virtues are distinct, right? It's not necessary that somebody who's brave would also be musical, in the deep sense of being with the muses, right? Like having a kind of sort of sensitivity to aesthetic concerns, right? That he would have a love of proportion and harmony and form, right? It's not necessary that that person would also be courageous, but you can see how they all kind of follow from, for Plato, they all follow from the love of truth and the love of wisdom, this erotic passion for truth above all, and to the exclusion of all, right? From that, he derives all of these other qualities that the statesman will have. And it's really interesting to see, if you just list them out like this, interesting to see how he does this. Because there's a good case to be made, right? That at some level, these things are unified, even though they can be found disparately within the human spirit. And this, I like the musical one because it's kind of interestingly related to justice, right? Justice is organizing things, suum cuique, each to his own, right? And it's putting each thing in its right place. And to be musical in the Greek sense is not just to be like good at playing the lyre, but to be genuinely attuned to the harmonies of creation, right? To the right proportions in things. And that's why you can even have kind of a sort of a musical body, right? Like that it's well proportioned, it has a good schema. All of these things are very intimately linked in Greek thought, and the figure of the statesman here emerges, right? The one of the first good, proper articulations of the ideal statesman is here in Republic Book 6. So we still haven't gotten to, where are these guys? Where are they to be found? Let's talk about that. If you are going to build the Young Heretics empire with me, you cannot afford to be bleeding money on unused subscriptions. Truebill is the solution to this. They are so good at these online companies at getting you signed up for things that you don't actually want or need. It's like, oh, we just have this free trial. Just, you need to read this one article. You just sign up for a free trial. You can cancel anytime. It's only $1 for the first month or something. And then it's like, 3 months later, you've totally forgotten about it. Suddenly there's this charge on your credit card for some stupid amount of money that you could have spent on like important stuff. Truebill is great because they will go through all of these subscriptions and find the ones you're not using and save you a bundle. On average, people save up to $720 a year. That's a lot of money that you could be using to build the Young Heretics empire. Matt B says, in a matter of seconds, I saved $660 for the year on DirecTV, $120 on SiriusXM, $840 a year on car insurance. That stuff adds up, man. And when your ex is watching Netflix on your account from like a year ago, you ought to check out Truebill. You can start canceling today at truebill.com/heretics. You got to go use that specific link for my listeners, truebill.com/heretics. It could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/heretics. Okay, so this is where we start getting into this, like, is Plato just the bullied nerd who's sore about the death of his teacher, or is he making a more subtle argument for why philosophers don't currently rule, right? And I definitely think that in these next few pages that I'm going to read, we have a response to Aristophanes' clouds, which Socrates in the Apology says was related to people's sort of negative opinion of him, which led to his death, right? So Plato has every right to be spitting mad about this kind of what you might call stigma or stereotype of philosophers, right? They're all these eggheads. They just live in boxes and they study the farts of gnats, and we can recognize this now. I mean, we all know that there is such a thing as somebody who is so obsessed with truth in the narrow sense, I guess, like pedantry, basically, that he becomes sort of unlikable and even difficult to be around and so forth. The question is my question here is whether Plato is like just owning that and being like, well, yeah, well, like you're a bully and you're never going to grow. I always think when people say to kids, I just rewatched, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's related to the Republic, I promise. I just rewatched The Never-Ending Story. It's a movie from the 80s. And it's this classic kind of tale of the bullied kid, the bullied nerd who goes into the attic and reads the book. And through the book, he, enters into this narrative of heroism. And the bullies are these kind of lunkheads that are really nasty to him. And I get that. I was a nerdy kid in school too, and I had bullies. And like, I understand this thing that you tell kids that like, your bullies are going to grow up to be sort of menial laborers and you are going to run the world and become Elon Musk. And like, that narrative is kind of threaded through a lot of these stories. And I think we might take it to excess to the point where like it's somehow inherently virtuous to be the skinny bullied nerd. And like, that's not true. Like part of the journey, at least for this skinny bullied nerd, right? Part of the journey is manning up a little bit and like getting in the gym and understanding there are things in the world besides books, and understanding that even your love of books, right, and your love of learning will be informed and fleshed out by a rich and robust engagement with life and with the world. And so I think that like this thing we tell kids where like, oh, the bullies are just the losers. Like maybe that's not always true. Like sometimes the bully just grows up to like, run a Fortune 500 company and then you have to deal with them there. Like, and so at some point you can't just sort of nurse your wounds and your grievances and say like, oh, like you'll see, you'll get yours. Like you have to kind of learn to stick up for yourself and get a little bit of thumos in your bones, so to speak. And so I think that like we in America have this very kind of coddling idea, which again, like all my sympathies are with bullied kids. I've been bullied. I know it sucks, but like I think we get something a little bit wrong when we make the bullied kid into the hero. Like the bullied kid has to stiffen up, has to man up and stiffen up a little bit too. And so I say all of this because we're now going to get into this question, right? Like, is Plato just the bullied nerd, or is he saying something different? I think it kind of shades, it kind of teeters on a knife edge, but I think he's saying something very, very different. I think we know that because he's been talking about thumos and all these things that philosopher kings will have Andrea and courage besides just like smarts. But I've said enough. Let's listen to what Plato has to say on this topic. Like, where do we find these people? And what would you say in response to this idea, right? Someone might say, this is Adamantus now intervening. Someone might say that in speech he can't contradict you at each particular thing asked, but indeed he sees that all those who start out on philosophy, not those who take it up for the sake of getting educated when they are young and then drop it, but those who linger in it for a longer time, most become quite queer, not to say completely vicious. This translation by the queer does not mean they don't become gay, they become sort of weird, right? Not to say completely vicious, while the ones who seem perfectly decent do nevertheless suffer at least one consequence of the practice you are praising, they become useless to the cities. So this is a famous question, right? Aren't philosophers just kind of useless to politics, right? And this is, I think this is lifted right out of clouds. I think that this is like a direct subtweet of Aristophanes. So let's listen to the answer here. He says, can it be good to say that the cities will have no rest from evils before the philosophers, whom we agree to be useless to the cities, rule in them? And this is Socrates. Now, the question you are asking needs an answer given through an image. And you in particular, he said, I suppose, aren't used to speaking through images. And this is a joke because, of course, this is all Socrates ever does in Plato is tell these like metaphors and stories, right? He says, all right, you were making fun of me after having involved me in an argument so hard to prove. At all events, listen to the image so that you may see still more how greedy I am for images. So hard is the condition suffered by the most decent men with respect to the cities that there is no single other condition like it. But I must make my image and apology on their behalf by bringing it together from many sources, as the painters paint goat stags and such things by making mixtures. Conceive something of this kind happening either on many ships or one. Though the shipowner surpasses everyone on board in height and strength, he is rather deaf, and likewise somewhat short-sighted, and his knowledge of seamanship is pretty much on the same level. The sailors are quarreling with one another about the piloting, each supposing he ought to pilot, although he has never learned the art and can't produce his teacher or prove there was a time when he was learning it. Besides this, they claim it isn't even teachable, and are ready to cut to pieces the man who says it is teachable. And they are always crowded around the shipowner himself, begging and doing everything so that he'll turn the rudder over to them. And sometimes, if they fail at persuasion and other men succeed at it, they either kill the others or throw them out of the ship. Enchaining the noble shipowner with mandrake, drink, or something else, they rule the ship, using what's in it, and drinking and feasting, they sail as such men would be thought likely to sail. Besides this, they praise and call skilled sailor, pilot, and knower of the ship's business the man who is clever at figuring out how they will get the rule, either by persuading or forcing the ship owner, while the man who is not of this sort they blame as useless. They don't know that for the true pilot, it is necessary to pay careful attention to year, seasons, heavens, stars, winds, and everything that's proper to the art if he is really going to be skilled at ruling a ship. And they don't suppose it's possible to acquire the art and practice of how one can get hold of the helm, whether the others wish it or not, and at the same time to acquire the pilot's skill. So, with such things happening on the ships, don't you believe that the true pilot will really be called a stargazer, a praetor, and useless to them by those who sail on ships run like this? Indeed he will, said Adamantus. So, obviously, again, right, Socrates is the praetor, right? He's the stargazer. He's the one stopping and looking into the sky, and he's useless to the cities. And he's saying the reason that that's happening is because you are the blind leading the blind. In the city of the blind, right? The person who can like steer the ship of state, who can grab the wheel of the ship of state is king. And this is a famous metaphor, right? The ship of state, the idea of the statesman as helmsman or pilot. And and the notion, by the way, that he's what in Greek is called a Kubernetes, which is the helmsman, the steerer, which is where we get our word for cybernetics. My colleague James Poulos points this out a lot. And so it's interesting to consider that cybernetics is another form of ruling, right? So a form of organizing and governing. But the main idea here, right, is that, and we're getting this theme of blindness that we're going to get in the cave as well, that basically human beings are in the condition of just sort of disastrous unknowing. And we hear the sophists here, right? That he's saying there are two different skills. There's the skill of getting power, and there's the skill of exercising power well, and those are distinct. And in our city, in Athens, the skill of getting power, namely the skill of rhetoric, the skill of making the weaker argument the stronger, is the skill that is valued and according to which rule is attributed, right? So we give people rule if they're good at getting it, not if they're good at exercising it. And this is, of course, right, a central idea about how corruption works, right? And I want to point out a few things about this, because you could say this is just sour grapes, right? You could say, well, Socrates is just, or Plato in the voice of Socrates is just being kind of huffy about it, about everything. And you could say that this is sort of like, well, if that's the case, then the philosopher is always going to be a bit sidelined, right? But I think that what Plato is saying is something a little bit different here, which is that philosophy, right? Most people who call themselves philosophers are actually just regime enforcers and flunkies, right? They are basically people who give cover fire for whatever the popular prejudice or the state mantra is. And you do see a lot of these folks out here now, right? You see people like Ibram X. Kendi, right? Or Robin DiAngelo, and even the fact checkers, right? These people who offer themselves as like intellectuals, but are really obviously just, laundering and recycling the talking points of the governing regime. And this is how Plato is viewing the sophists here. And in order to understand that, we should read through, I think, this, what happens if you don't believe the sophists. This is a really fascinating, again, presaging, laying the groundwork for the cave. Let me read to you about what happens if somebody dissents from the sort of sophist rhetorical regime. All right. When many gather together, sit down in assemblies, says Socrates, courts, theaters, army camps, or any other common meeting of a multitude, and with a great deal of uproar blame some of the things said or done, and praise others, both in excess, shouting and clapping, and besides, the rocks and the very place surrounding them echo and redouble the uproar of blame and praise. Blame and praise, rather. This is, in then the laws, he's going to call this theatrocracy, and basically arguing again that Athens loves people who can persuade and can gain power, but not necessarily people who can use power well. Now, in such circumstances, as the saying goes, what do you suppose is the state of the young man's heart? Or what kind of private education will hold out for him and not be swept away by such blame and praise as can go, borne by the flood, wherever it tends, so that he'll say the same things are noble and base as they do, practice what they practice, and be such as they are. The necessity is great, Socrates, says Adeimantus. And so remember when I said that in talking to Glaucon, Socrates is shown both articulating philosophy, the philosophy of statesmanship in the abstract, and appealing to the fleshly ambitions of the man in front of him, right? And this is one great way in which Plato really captures what Socrates must have been like, because he was really good at relating to the youth, right? He was good at talking to the ambitious and wealthy young men who might go on to rule the city. And he talks to them about higher things by reference to the world that they knew, right? And so he's saying the world that these guys know is a world of ambition. They want to get ahead naturally. The young men, they want to get ahead. And if the thing to do to get ahead is to assent to the gods of the city and to the sophistry of the city, then that's what people are going to do. This is what I talked about a while back when I said you get what you honor. You become what you honor, right? Whatever is the highest honored thing in your society, if you award a prize for like transfeminist queer studies, you're going to get a lot of people going into transfeminist queer studies. And we're seeing this now when all these kids are identifying as like LGBTQIA++. It's like, I don't think they like suddenly all these kids have become gay and trans. I think that in our woke doctrine, being somehow non-normal, non-straight, affords you a certain privilege, makes you part of a privileged class. And so kids are rushing to claim that thing because you get what you honor. If you give a prize for like, great art, then you're going to get more great artists in service of the state. If you give a prize for patriotic art, whatever you honor, good or bad, that's what you'll get. And so that's what he's saying here. He's saying if true philosophy is not honored, then even those who have inherently the nature, which by the way is very rare, right? These rare qualities of statesmanship, the raw materials of statesmanship. If you come up to somebody, one of these young guys with a lot of talent, and a lot of natural inclination to philosophy, and you say, okay, you got raw talent, now you need instruction, right? Now you need to be shaped. Then he's going to be like, buzz off, old man. Like, I want to get the honors and I want to go and, do this sort of rhetorical game. So Socrates goes on. We still haven't mentioned the greatest necessity, what these educators and sophists inflict indeed when they fail to persuade in speech. Or don't you know that they punish the man who's not persuaded with dishonor, fines, and death? Yes, he said, they punish very severely. So this is here is Socrates, right? And so what he's arguing is not that, like, he's kind of arguing that a prophet is never honored in his own hometown, great men are never recognized in their time. But he's saying there's an actual unjust system here that is giving the name of philosophy to what is actually just regime enforcement. And this, I think, is a very apt analysis also of our condition today, especially the part where if you dissent, if you don't believe, right, then you are punished and fined and hounded, right? Think about the Babylon Bee, right? They named Rachel/Richard Levine Man of the Year, right? And they got suspended from Twitter, right? Because this is what happens when you aren't persuaded, right? Here's a school schools in Fairfax County in Virginia are thinking about suspending students for, quote, malicious misgendering, namely saying, I'm not persuaded that men can be women and women can be men. This is the sophist regime in evidence, right? This is our sophistry. And it's very much alive in our time as it was in Athens, because our time is also a time of excess democratic sentiment. Not that democracy inherently is bad, not that democratic procedures are bad, but that it is supposed to be one element in a republic that has now gone wild like wildfire and become our governing passion, this obsession, right, with I'm as good as you, as Screwtape puts it, and of just, kind of a war of words, right, a rhetorical war of words. This is the condition under which you get the honors that are afforded to sophistry and not to philosophy. And so Plato is saying it doesn't have to be this way. Like, you can actually afford honors to true philosophy, and then you're going to get more philosophers, right? But it's almost impossible, he does admit, right? Because it's very rare to get a good statesman, the option of a good statesman anyway. It's very rare to get somebody with the raw talent. And then you have to cultivate that talent, and you have to do so using a system that probably was already put in place by wise people. And so this stuff has a momentum, right? It has a recursive quality to it. But if you get off the loop, or if you don't get the momentum going at first, then it's very, very difficult to break the negative cycle. But here's a but, and it's a good but. Virtue is attractive. And there's an interesting combination here between spiritual virtue and physical beauty that I want to read, because it's part of, I think it's part of a lot of online conservative rhetoric right now too. He says, what do you suppose such a young man will do in such circumstances, especially if he chances to be from a big city, is rich and noble in it, and is further good-looking and tall? Won't he be overflowing with unbounded hope, believing he will be competent to mind the business of both Greeks and barbarians? And won't he, as a result, exalt himself to the heights, mindlessly full of pretension and empty conceit? Indeed he will, he said. Now, if someone were gently to approach the young man in his condition and tell him the truth, that he has no intelligence in him, although he needs it, and that it's not to be acquired except by slaving for its acquisition, what do you think? Do you think it will be easy for him to hear through a wall of so many evils? Far from it, he said. But if, he said, thanks to his good nature and his kinship to such speeches, one young man were to apprehend something and be turned and drawn toward philosophy, what do we suppose those will do who believe they are losing his use and comradeship? Is there any deed they won't do or word they won't say concerning him, so that he won't be persuaded, and concerning the man who's doing the persuading, so that he won't be able to persuade? And won't they organize private plots and public trials? It's very necessary. So he's saying there's a way. It doesn't have to be this way. There is a way, right, to let virtue reach its highest potential through instruction. But because resentment hates excellence, right, and is rebuked by excellence. Because of that, in communities where you have this sort of perverse cycle going on of rewarding people for persuasion and false rhetoric. Somebody who tries to turn aside to philosophy is going to look useless to the state. And it's not just Socrates whom we have in mind here, but it's very much also Alcibiades. And I think that we haven't really talked that much about Alcibiades on the show, although in the symposium we did, because he bursts in at the end. This is the guy who drunkenly crashes the party and says, like, Socrates ruined me. He made me useless to the state by addicting me, by turning my erotic passion toward himself and through him to the truth, right? And this is why I tried to sleep with him, but he wouldn't because he was so Platonic, but I was so, lusty. And this is Alcibiades is like Socrates' greatest failure in this way, right? And he was a complicated figure. He was hugely powerful during the Peloponnesian War, but he changed allegiances, right? He ended up defecting to Sparta and then to Persia, and his life was powerfully complicated by the fact that he had all of these gifts. He was handsome. He was skilled. He was very smooth rhetorically. He was a smart statesman. And he had an inclination, but an imperfect inclination, to the true and the good and the beautiful. And so Socrates is basically saying, like, from one perspective, I ruined Alcibiades. But from another perspective, I saved him. Right? And so the irreducible question here is, like, what is it to be a good man in a bad state? And that is why we come back once again to this thing about, like, if you're just, but you're punished for it, is it still good to be just? Like, Socrates is here sticking to his principles. And as Plato knows, and we know, right, like, he did so unto death. So I think it's actually very admirable and courageous what he's saying, even though there is a way to read it as like sour grapes. But I think that is something else entirely. He's saying, the world is a world of injustice, a veil of sorrows, and it's very difficult, therefore, to muscle somebody out of this cycle that just chews up ambition and directs it toward vice, right? And this is, again, what I'm saying about when I go on about, like, the kids in school who are all declaring themselves transgender. It's like they're doing that because they're in a system that rewards certain behaviors. And ambitious and skillful people are going, if they don't have some other form of training, they're going to try to play in that system because they're going to want power, they're going to want success. And if you try to take them aside and say, well, men actually are men and women are women, and like, then there will be social consequences. Sophists punish those whom they can't persuade, right? They inflict when they cannot persuade, as he says in this book. It's a brilliant book. I mean, book 6 might be my favorite book. It's so brilliant and astute about how these dynamics work. And it also now will turn to introduce the governing metaphor of the cave. So we've laid a lot of groundwork of the cave, right? The blindness of the masses, the dishonor afforded to true philosophy because the sophists have sort of skill to manipulate the crowd. The demagogues and the sophists can manipulate the crowd, and the punishment that attains when you try to, like, seek virtue, and truth, and all of these things are closely related. Now we're going to turn to beauty is truth and truth is beauty, or are they, right? That's the sort of next and last part of this book. I know a lot of people are hiring out there, and if you are hiring at all, you need Indeed. They are the one-stop job posting website where you are guaranteed to find quality applications that meet your must-have requirements, or else you don't pay, which is really a nice feature. With Instant Match, as soon as you sponsor a post, you get a short list of quality candidates with resumes on Indeed that match your job description, and you can invite them to apply right away. They partner with you at every stage of the hiring process to find great talent. We use them here at Soundfront. Obviously, I was not found through Indeed, or I would be a much more impressive character. But all the folks that make these podcasts, we use Indeed over at Soundfront. They've been great for finding excellent talent. And I know it can be hard these days to hire. It can be hard to snag the right folks. This is really the place to go. They have a special deal just for my listeners. You can start hiring right now with a $75 sponsored job credit when you upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/heretics. That's Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 job credit. Indeed.com/heretics. Terms and conditions do apply, but if you need to hire, you need Indeed. So the journey that we take to get here, to this sort of change of subject, right? Like, what is truth? What is beauty? Is that Socrates has set up this sort of recursive cycle, right? This pattern that dishonors true statesmanship, true philosophy, true excellence, and shunts the good out of society. He's basically saying philosophy doesn't make you useless to the city. The city refuses to use philosophers, right? The city takes true philosophers and either exiles them and shuns them, or it perverts them and kind of assimilates them into their own like amoeba of just power play. So how could it ever be that we could break this cycle? We keep talking about like, the good city is ruled by philosopher kings. How can a city take philosophy in hand without being destroyed? And this is where he talks about what we might call the blank slate, right? Let me read this. He says, if the many become aware that what we are saying about this man is true, will they be harsh with the philosophers and distrust us when we say that a city could never be happy otherwise than by having its outlines drawn by the painters who use the divine pattern? Painters use the divine pattern, right? Looking at the true, the good, and the beautiful and enacting in the here and now, sort of like I was talking about last week through prudence, right? What does it look like to enact the true, the good, and the beautiful according to the divine pattern? They won't be harsh, he said, provided they do gain this awareness. But what kind of drawing do you mean? They would take the city and the dispositions of human beings as though they were a tablet, which in the first place they would wipe clean, and that's hardly easy. At all events, you know that straight off in this, they would differ from the rest in not being willing to take either private man or city in hand, or to draw laws before they receive it clean or themselves make it so. This is kind of where we veer back into this like a weird authoritarianism, the year zero, right? In order to do this, you kind of have to wipe the slate clean. And like this, again, we do veer here sort of into fantasy and into the part of the project that is aiming at conceptual perfection rather than workability. And the laws is going to talk more about, well, how can you kind of nudge people rather than wiping them clean? How can you nudge them in this direction? But either way, it turns out that the key to building the regime is education, because we've already talked about like what is the formation of a young man going to be if he has the makings of a good statesman, right? And education, this is why in classical philosophy, education has such a role to play in the state, and why now today we're having all these fights about OK Groomer and Virginia and CRT and Disney, right? It's funny how these things like, they flash by in the news, but once you kind of read these classical sources, you can see that they are deep-seated, urgent philosophical issues, right? Why do kids get so passionate? Or why rather do parents get so passionate when they see their kids being indoctrinated into a regime they don't like? It's because they intuitively sense what Plato is articulating here, which is that education shapes the state because it shapes the people who are coming out. If you read Aaron Sibarium now, he's writing all these pieces about, the new generation of law school students and college students. And we have a piece also by Max Eden in The American Mind called The Metaversity 8, The University. It's about how like kids come into school now already and sort of conditioned, their souls sort of shaped by their online communities, so that they are taking over these institutions. And that's part of how the woke revolution is formed, is through the miseducation of America's elites. And so attempts to roll that back are statesmanship. That's why DeSantis is doing this stuff. That's why Youngkin won his fight in Virginia. Like, it's because doing this is the job of the statesman, right? Is reshaping the way that we indoctrinate our kids. It's not that indoctrination is like inherently, all education is in some sense indoctrination, like in this regard, that it teaches you, how to think about the world. But we want indoctrination toward the truth. And especially in our public schools, we want that, right? So this kind of statesmanship is perfectly legitimate. In fact, it is the job of the statesman, right? To be sweeping negative indoctrination out of the schools. So what if, right? What if we got to teach the good in the schools? What would we teach, right? And here is where the metaphor of the sun begins to come in. And he starts from this very kind of central, again, there are a lot of, I think, really core ideas here that are central to a lot of Greek philosophy. And one of them is that people do things because of what they think is good. And this is kind of related to the question, like, does anybody knowingly sin? And it's a major difference between pagan philosophy and Christian ethics in some regards, because like Augustine famously in his Confession says, like, I stole fruit. I wanted to. I just did it. I knew it was bad, and I did it because I knew it was bad. And so the doctrine of the fall sort of implies that, there is such a thing as like knowing that something is bad, knowing that it's self-destructive and wanting to do it anyway, doing the thing that you don't want to do, not wanting to do the things you do, so forth. In classical philosophy, though, there's more of a sense that people who are doing things, and both of these things I think can actually be true. Like, people who do things do them because they believe there is some good that they're getting out of it. And even if they wouldn't tell you that, they still act in ways that it's called revealed preference, right? So like, you might, for example, want cake really badly. And you might also want to be fit. And you might say, I want to be fit. I want to lose weight. But if you eat the cake, right, there's some part of you at least that makes cake into the highest good, or let's say the pleasures of taste, right, into the highest good. And so that sense, that like deeply ingrained belief motivates everything we do, because all action aims towards some purpose, and purposes mean the good, right? A purpose is a good. That's sort of, it's impossible to distinguish those two things. So this is what every soul pursues, for the sake of which it does everything. The soul divines that it is something, but is at a loss about it and unable to get a sufficient grasp of just what it is. And the good is something. The soul knows there's a good. Inherently, souls move toward goods, and that's what souls are. They're like good-seeking machines. But we're at a loss about what the good is, or how to get at it, or what it is, or how to have a stable trust such as it has about the rest of things. And because this is so, the soul loses any profit there might have been in the rest. Will we say that even those best men in the city, into whose hands we put everything, must be thus in the dark about a thing of this kind and importance? Least of all, he says, so education is education about the good, right? We need people to be able not only to have a sense that there is some good out there and to want it, but they can't just follow any desire that they have, because our desires are confused, and we have this confusion about what the good is. And so philosophy means seeking the good first of all, because it is what exists, right? It's what is. And now we're getting up to this good beauty is truth, truth beauty, and we're getting up to this idea of true philosophy with which we ended book 5. And here's the sun metaphor that sort of ties it all together. You know that eyes, when one no longer turns them to those things over whose colors the light of day extends, but to those over which the gleams of night extend, are dimmed and appear nearly blind, as though pure sight were not in them. Quite so, he said. This is Glaucon now again with Socrates. But I suppose when one turns them on those things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and sight shows itself to be in these same eyes. Surely. Well then, think that the soul is also characterized in this way when it fixes itself on that which is illumined by truth, and that which is, it intellects, knows, and appears to possess intelligence. But when it fixes itself on that which is mixed with darkness, on coming into being and passing away, it opines and is dimmed, changing opinions up and down, and seems at such times not to possess intelligence. Yes, that's the way it seems. Therefore, say that what provides the truth to the things known and gives the power to the one who knows is the idea of the good. And as the cause of knowledge and truth, you can understand it to be a thing known. But as fair as these two are, knowledge and truth, if you believe that it is something different from them and still fairer than they, your belief will be right. As for knowledge and truth, just as in the other region it is right to hold light and sight sun-like, but to believe them to be sun is not right, so too here, to hold these two to be like the good is right, but to believe that either of them is the good is not right. The condition which characterizes the good must receive still greater honor. So he's drawing a very complex analogy here between the sun, light, and sight, right? So we have a faculty called sight. It requires some illumination, right? It requires some sort of function from outside to be able to work, to be able to see. But that illumination, the light, comes from a source, right? And he's saying, just like that, our soul, right, seeks knowledge and knowledge of truth. But there must be some other thing, some source from which knowledge and truth proceed, or rather, through which the soul is illuminated to have knowledge of truth. You speak of an overwhelming beauty, said Glaucon, if it provides knowledge and truth, but is itself beyond them in beauty. You surely don't mean it is pleasure. Hush, Glaucon, I said, but consider its image still further in this way. How? I suppose you'll say the sun not only provides what is seen with the power of being seen, but also with generation, growth, and nourishment, although it isn't itself generation. Of course, therefore say that not only being known is present in the things known as a consequence of the good, but also existence and being are in them besides as a result of it, although the good isn't being, but is still beyond being, exceeding it in dignity and power. And Glaucon quite ridiculously said, Apollo, what a demonic excess! You, I said, are responsible for compelling me to tell my opinions about it, and don't under any conditions stop, he said, at least until you have gone through the likeness with the sun, if you were leaving anything out. But of course I am leaving out a throng of things. I suppose I will leave out quite a bit. But all the same, insofar as it's possible, I'll not leave out anything willingly. And we're going to get to a second on one last bit, but I want to dwell on this metaphor because this is the metaphor that will underpin the cave, right? Because when you get out of the cave, you look at the sun. The reason for that is they've just spent all this time talking about this metaphor, right? Sight is inherently related to vision, or rather to light. Sight is inherently related to light, and light is inherently related to the sun. Even though they are distinct things, right? We can't understand them properly except by understanding them in relation to one another. What is sight? It's the faculty that is designed to receive light. What is light? It's the illumination that comes from the sun, right? And so the sun is not itself, right? If you look at the sun, you go blind. But nevertheless, like without the sun, you can't see any of the things around you. And just in the same way, right? This highest good, right? This being in itself, good in itself, transcends all these things, right? It emanates forth, and we see beauty, right? And we sense the truth of it, even if we are confused, right? About just as we can be confused with shadows, right? And confused in our sight, right? There is a source that we know. We can't look directly at it, but we know there is a source. And of course, in Plato, as in Christian ethics, that source is God, right? And it is divine. And Aristotle is going to trouble and complicate this in ways that we will talk about. But I still think that it's a powerful image. It's an enduring image, right? Because it distinguishes between things which are nevertheless intimately in union, much like the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, you might say, right? Sight, light, and the Son, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. The Son being the Father, the light being the Holy Ghost, and the sight or the fact of its sort of particular existence in the world being the sun, or however you want to sort of draw these analogies. The idea is, right, that this Trinity is at the heart of the world. Like even if you've never read the Nicene Creed, if the Council of Nicaea had never happened, it would still be folded into creation, and the unity of the good can still be Trinitarian, right, in nature. There's so much here, and we could go on forever. I want to note that he then goes on to do this thing called the divided line, which you might hear about that, so I want to tell you about it. It's that if you have intelligible things and sensory things, then you have intelligible things that are purely intelligible without any sort of illustration, like the good, right? Or even just abstractions like number. But then you have intelligible things that are sort of reached by hypothesis, like in geometry, where you kind of give illustrations and physical depictions of things, even though they stand in for higher principles. And then you have below that sort of the intelligible, or rather the sensory things that you can see, and then the illusions, that sort of depictions of the sensory things, which will come back in book 10. So we'll revisit the divided line in book 10, but there's sort of this distinction between different levels of closeness to reality. The furthest away being like a painting of a bed, and then you have a bed, right? And then you have maybe a sort of diagram of like the abstract ideal bed, and then you have perhaps grasping the form of the bed or the form of furniture or whatever. We'll get into that a little bit more. I wanted to end mostly with the sun, because the sun is coming back, right? Here comes the sun next time around when we talk about the cave. All right, let's take a mailbag question from our friends over on Locals. Yo, I love Theragun. I have been using this since before they were a sponsor of the show. I'm so stoked that they are sponsors of the show. This is a handheld percussive therapy device that releases your deepest muscle tension using a scientifically calibrated combo of depth, speed, and power, and it's as quiet as an electric toothbrush. You might think you don't need this, and you would be shocked, man. I tell you, even if you don't work out a lot like I do, even if you just spend your day sort of sitting at a computer, that too lets a lot of stress and tension into your body. Don't let the stress of daily life weigh on your body. You will feel better when you check out Theragun. They have an OLED screen and design. Check out Theragun, whether you want to treat your muscle tension from working out, an injury, or just the stresses of everyday life. There is no substitute for the Theragun Gen 4, and they've given my listeners a special discount. You try Theragun for 30 days at only $199. Go to therabody.com/heretics right now, and you'll get your Gen 4 Theragun. Try it out for 30 days, starting at only $199. That's therabody.com/heretics, therabody.com/heretics. Mailbag questions come to me through Locals, which is just a blast. It's so fun over there. It's youngheretics.com/locals to become a VIP. We talk really kind of endlessly about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and how to seek and live them out in our lives. I do a weekly live stream where we answer all sorts of questions. And of course, only VIPs can be in the mailbag. So do come join us. I would love to see you there at youngheretics.com/locals. Here's Jana, a question from Jana. How much do you think it matters to have read prerequisites before tackling many of the classics? one who hasn't read the Bible or much Greek mythology before reading Shakespeare, or Shakespeare before more recent greats, for example, sometimes I get overwhelmed with prerequisites, as when I recently took a break from Barzan to read some of those he was discussing, even though I know there's no catching up to Barzan. It's hopeless. Okay, yeah, this is great. So Barzan, I often recommend Barzan's book, From Dawn to Decadence. I think it's a great survey if you're looking for one. But right, it can become incredibly daunting to feel like, and I've had different versions of this question before, like I get into a poem and like every line has an allusion to something that I haven't read, so then I have to go read that thing, but then that thing has allusions to other things. I would say that there are 3 foundational texts which you should read before you embark on your own kind of personal rabbit holes. I think 3 is a manageable number. You could ratchet it up to 5, but let me just start with 3. Homer's Iliad, the entire Bible, and the complete works of Shakespeare. And those will take a long time in and of themselves. And there will be references within those as well that you don't immediately understand. But those are kind of bedrock texts. I call them bedrock texts because they stand at the fountainhead of the major traditions. Shakespeare sort of stands at the fountainhead of modern English literature, in my opinion. The Bible stands at the fountainhead of, all Judeo-Christian teaching, obviously. And then Homer stands at the fountainhead of the Greek literary tradition, which would become the Roman literary tradition as well. I would recommend to anybody that they read those texts first, but I wouldn't recommend that they then feel as if, I really feel like you don't need to bother yourself about knowing every possible reference in every work that you read. It's okay if you don't understand some of the stuff that you read the first time around. And it's okay if you go back later on and you think like, oh, I get it. I get what that was saying there. That's part of the reading process. Like nobody alive, myself very much included, like nobody doesn't have that experience. I still have that experience all the time. I'll read something in a new genre. I mean, like I'm studying Japanese now. So I'll like enter into Japanese literature and I'll be like, well, where the hell do I begin? It's like there are a few foundational texts, but then after that, you're just going to have to accept, right, that sometimes this stuff marinates within you and you'll catch things you didn't catch before. I mean, this is part of the whole job of scholarship. So I would suggest like, yes, it's very easy to get bogged down and overwhelmed. And I would say like, that's the whole game. Like the game of doing all the prerequisites is the game. And I would keep your list of actual prerequisites limited, like things that you actually have to have read before you embark upon reading the classics of the West. And I would say the Iliad, the Bible, and Shakespeare. You could toss in the 4 dialogues of Plato, the Euthyphro Apology, Crito, and Phaedo if you wanted. You could toss that in. Which is basically counts as one work. And you could also put in like the Aeneid, perhaps. But I would really think that like start with those, then go do some reading and go down rabbit holes. It's like, that's the adventure, man. Like they didn't mean for you to know every reference when they wrote these texts even. They meant for them to unfold like flowers before you. All right. Thank you, Jana. See you on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. That's it for me. I will see you next week. Thank you, as always, for listening. And don't forget to go check out the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, and you can donate to support our work in defense of the American idea at claremont.org/donate. All right, folks, I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.